Alrighty. So Quintus Julius Rusticus.
How do you say his last name?
Rusticus
Rusticus.
lived circa around 100 to 170 AD.
Go on.
Justin Martyr.
Quintus Julius Rusticus.
That's what I'm saying. I thought it was.
You can call him Rusty for short if you'd like.
Rusticus.
All right. Justin Martyr, circa around 100 to 165. So there we go. First question for you. If Rusticus lived from 100 to 170 and Justin Martyr was martyred, what year do you think Justin Martyr was probably martyred around?
165.
You say that like you're questioning.
Well, that's when he died.
Okay, well, I'm just making sure you're on the same page. I'm just making sure you're awake this morning.
I'm gonna bet that that's why we have the word martyr.
Martyr, yeah. Exactly. All right. Rusticus served as an urban prefect or a governor of Rome between 162 and 168. Okay, he is notable for presiding over the trial of Justin Martyr, and it was actually Rusticus who sentenced Justin Martyr to death. Okay, in that trial. And I wanted to read to you to start out this morning a little bit of the dialogue in Justin Martyr's case. Rusticus interrogated Justin Martyr and his associates. He asked, "What sort of life do you lead? What are your doctrines? You admit that you're a Christian?" To each question, the Christian made a direct reply. Then the prefect Rusticus demanded, "Where do you meet?" "Wherever it is each one's preference or opportunity," said Justin. "In any case, do you suppose we can all meet in the same place?" Rusticus wanted to maybe extract some more details, maybe figure out some additional identities of folks who worshiped the Christ, continued pressing him, and said, "Tell me, where do you meet? In what place?" Justin said, "I have been living above the baths for the entire period of my sojourn at Rome, and I've known no other meeting place but here. Anyone who desired could come to my residence, and I would give him the words of truth." Here's some ways that, and think about this, here's some ways that we talk or think about church today. Just a few ideas. Wow, that church is huge. I imagine they've got some large electric bills. I go to church at so-and-so place. That is a beautiful church. It has gorgeous windows. How often have you heard a pastor say, "Welcome, what a wonderful day it is in the house of the Lord"? As a kid, I was told, "Do not run." Well, we don't run in God's house. And even a modern worship song says, "There's joy in the house of the Lord today." What are some of the things you've heard?
I mean, be respectful. This is God's holy house.
Yep.
Come to the altar and be forgiven.
I have no doubt that these ideas, these sentiments were not authentic, that they were not well intentioned. I don't doubt the hearts, I don't doubt the motives. But these ideas going to a place as the church is such a foreign concept to the first century believers. It's something so foreign and something that they would have never even thought about. A couple words for you.
Wait, Daddy, before you play, so the Quintus Julius Rusticus, he was the judge or the lawyer?
He was the governor. He was the prefect of Rome.
Okay, and then what was his relationship with Justin Martyr again?
Justin Martyr was one of the early church fathers. Okay, he lived in the 2nd century. Okay, and Justin was martyred for his faith. So at the end of this trial, Rusticus condemned him to death. Okay.
Just for being a believer.
Just for being a believer. Just for being a Christian.
Inquisition.
So that's what he was guilty of, just as
Mhm.
Christianity?
Yep.
Was it illegal to be a Christian at the time?
It wasn't necessarily illegal. It was other. It was strange. And we'll talk more about worship and those kinds of things later on. But I wanted, my intent with reading that dialogue to you was the fact that when he was pressed, where do you worship? Where does everyone come and come worship together? Justin was saying, I've been hanging out in my bath, up above the baths, living above the baths of Rome. People are welcome to come anytime they wanted to, and whenever they did, I'd share the gospel with them. So the point of it again, it wasn't necessarily a specific location, but rather what we see and what Justin communicated to Rusticus was, it's in the privacy of my own home, okay, above baths of any place. Okay. First word here is ecclesia. Greek word simply means called out ones, or congregation is a word that we can kind of take the same meaning.
Does that have any relation to Ecclesiastes?
No.
It's Hebrew or Greek?
That's Greek. Ecclesiastes would have been Hebrew. Okay. Another one is koine. Or sorry, koinonia. Koine is the type of Greek back then, common Greek. Koinonia means fellowship or communion. Now, ecclesia was actually used in the New Testament 114 times. And then a third word for you. Kuriakon. This is actually a form of the Greek word kurios, which means Lord or Master. Kuriakon means belonging to the Lord. Now, kuriakon is where we actually get the English word church. This is the word from which we derive church. Okay? So if we're to look at these three words, and again, these all have similarities or implications of the church, depending on context. But ecclesia describes who the church is made up of. Ecclesia describes the people, where koinonia describes what they do. So ecclesia are the people that have been called out by God. Koinonia it's those people fellowshipping. It's the fellowship that they do. In other words, they are communing together. And then kuriakon is actually a very generic term. And it's anything, describing anything, not necessarily just people, but anything that belongs or has been dedicated to the Lord. Okay? So one of the interesting facts about this is that when the King James translators were translating the Bible, there was obviously some political turmoil there. Tyndale refused to use any other word except congregation for ecclesia. When he translated the New Testament and he translated the word ecclesia, he was adamant about using congregation. The translators of the King James Version chose to use the word church for ecclesia. Why? Well, because congregation was the term most commonly used by the Puritans, and the King James translators had nothing to do with them. So what we see in that translation is that where we should have used the word congregation, we started seeing this idea, this word church, for ecclesia.
Is that a more correct translation?
Congregation is, yes.
So Tyndale was the one that wanted to use congregation?
Yep.
And then the King James Version uses church?
Yes. Okay?
Which makes no sense because they were using part of Tyndale's thing to translate. That makes
Right,
no sense.
but they hated the Puritans so much that they did not want to be associated with the term congregation. And so eventually what ended up happening was kuriakon came to be roughly translated as simply meaning God's house.
Wait, so what you just said?
So eventually over time, kuriakon took on a generic meaning of God's house. So when you put all of this together and you're kind of thinking about how did we get to where we're at? I mean, that's kind of the thought where that we're kind of pursuing. How did we get here? Okay. Ecclesia, of course, referred to congregation. Okay. Again, thinking about a building to the first century Christians was unheard of when they talked about the church. But Clement of Alexandria in 190 AD, I know I'm giving you a lot of dates, but just think about this. 190 years or 160 years, I guess, after Christ, Clement of Alexandria used the term ecclesia to refer to a meeting place. Okay? He was actually the first person that we know of to coin the phrase, "I'm going to church." But when he used this phrase, he wasn't actually talking about a building erected for the specific purposes of worship. What he was referring to was the house of believers. He was referring to going to a house church. So we have no evidence whatsoever of believers worshiping in any special building dedicated to the Lord until actually the year 300. So for the first 3 centuries, we see believers worshiping in the houses of other believers. There's a few reasons why. I won't list them up here on the board, But if you want to write them down, you can. You can obviously watch the video later and review them. But some people believe that the early Christians didn't erect specific buildings to worship God because they weren't allowed to. Maybe it was against the law. Okay? There's actually no historical evidence to prove that that was the case. Okay, that is just a belief, but we don't have anything that tells us that this belief is actually accurate. It's just maybe an assumption. But we do have evidence to suggest three other possibilities. One was because they lived in fear. When we started seeing the latter part of the 2nd century and the early part of the 3rd century, we started seeing persecution erupt against the believers. We'll come back to that in a minute, but we started seeing believers starting to live in fear. And so they didn't want to attract a lot of attention. They wanted to live under the radar. So they didn't build huge buildings to worship God in.
So it's like today in China.
Exactly. Okay. And there's other countries that are not, I would say, hostile to the gospel, but you're not allowed to evangelize. You're able to receive folks to come into worshiping Christ, but you're not actually able to go out and proselytize the gospel.
India,
yeah. The second accurate but third reason is because they were expecting Christ to return any day now. It didn't make sense for them to engage in a building campaign if Jesus Christ was coming the next week. In other words, they lived with expectation. Now, stop there for a second. Sorry, I just got to ask. I have to wonder, I can't help to question, how much do believers today live in expectation of Christ's return?
I had a dream about it this week.
Good.
They better,
That was
because it's getting
raptured.
crazy out there.
It is. But when we as a body of believers engage in multi-year building campaigns, it kind of makes you scratch your head and say, why?
I think a lot.
I'm not doubting their intent. I'm not doubting their heart. But what I am wondering is, how much do we live in expectation when the Bible tells us don't do that? Say if Christ should tarry, say you'll do this. But I wonder how many people today actually live in eager expectation.
I think a lot of it is just like, I think some Christians are discouraged, like, because they hear it all the time. Oh, the Lord's coming soon. The Lord's coming soon. The Lord's coming soon. My grandparents said it. I think now it's just like there's some Christians who maybe not be strong in their faith or something. They're like, yeah, that's what great grandma said too, and we're still here. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. Versus like me, I love Revelations, and I everything seems to be falling, and I follow all the crazy people that are like, oh, look at this, stuff like that. Versus I think about it all the time.
But I think it's good. I think we need to remind ourselves and not be, I don't know how to say it, but reactionary in our remembrance. Mm-hmm. In other words, seeing what's going on around us and be like, oh, well, I know Christ is coming soon because the Bible says all this stuff. But it's not more of us being reactionary to our external circumstances, but us waking up each morning and eagerly expecting Jesus Christ. To borrow the parable that Jesus spoke and that we talked about a couple weeks ago, being those virgins who are constantly keeping their lanterns lit. Living with such anticipation and expectation. So the fourth reason here, or the third accurate reason, however you want to number this, is the Christians of the 1st and 2nd centuries were determined to live radically different. Okay? And what I mean by that is this. They they were determined not to build buildings. And the reason for this is because the Jews had their synagogues, and the pagans, i.e. Romans and the Greeks, had their temples dedicated to their gods. And so the first and second century believers, again, were adamant about not building such buildings because they wanted to show how different they were. And so you could say that Christianity was born out of a house church movement. As a matter of fact, what we do know is that there is, from what we can tell, there is no other religion in 1st and 2nd century that had no temples except for Christianity. Christianity was the only religion in the 1st and 2nd centuries that had no formal dedicated places of worship. Now, one of the things that we also have, that we've seen, and we have found this through archaeology, is there is a community, a town, okay, Duroropus.
Is that one word?
It's hyphenated.
This is a place.
It is a place. You can look at it online. It was intact until about 2011 to 2014, when there was some battles going on in the Middle East. Unfortunately they destroyed a lot of the area.
What does
But
that numbers mean, Daddy?
that's when the town was formed, 232 AD. Okay, Duroropus, they actually found 3 homes in the remains in Duroropus, and one of those homes was dedicated to a Persian god named Mithra, and which the Romans borrowed. And the second home was actually a Christian home. The home at Duroropus was the first evidence that I guess just to say the oldest evidence that we have of a house church. Duroropus is about 300 feet in elevation above the Euphrates River. You looking at a picture?
I am looking at a
Yeah.
picture. Visual learner.
Yeah.
Is that the house?
I guess it says the oldest synagogue in the world.
I don't know about synagogue,
Well,
but
that's what
yeah.
what Google says.
That's 300 feet in elevation above the southwestern side of the Euphrates River. Okay, it's close to modern day Syria, and Duroropus was besieged in 256 by the Sassanians. Okay, and the reason these 3 homes were among those preserved was because in this siege, interestingly enough, the inhabitants of Duroropus felt, hey, if we can protect our wall, our western wall, by packing sand and dirt against it, maybe it could withhold the enemy. So by them packing down dirt against their western wall, they were able to preserve some of these ruins naturally. And so the Sassanians took over, they conquered Duroropus, and they took all of their people and made them into slaves and left this place to rot. So the remaining town that was exposed crumbled, but a few homes, like I said, were preserved because the people proactively packed them down to protect their wall. In this house, there was an inner wall that was torn down, and it made a larger room that could sit approximately 70 people. It had a baptistry. Okay, they had a area in which they could baptize people, but even though the church still esteemed baptism and the role of baptism, the baptism pool had not yet been established. And so what you found in this home was a small area for baptism. Actually so small, so shallow that it would have been physically impossible to actually submerge anyone in the pool. So therefore, baptism could have been done by sprinkling or by pouring. Right? Question to you, and we've had this conversation, does baptism have to happen through submersion? Now I know the word baptism means to submerge, and I know that it was a practice common to the Jewish church. Christians didn't come up with this. But what we see here is evidence that it didn't always occur with full submersion. The last fact about this, let me make sure I spell this right. This was also known as a Tituli church. For my Latin students, what does that mean? Anybody?
I don't know.
I don't think
It looks
you're-
familiar.
you're-
I don't know though.
I don't know all the words in Latin.
You better get studying.
Uh-huh.
Both you girls stay one.
Yes.
Also known as a title church. In this house and in other houses in the 1st and 2nd century, we find plaques on the wall saying give thanks to so-and-so. And even in this house, they list 2 people's names of the original owners of the house. It says, remember these 2 folks when you're praying to the Lord. And what this means is that when we read in Acts that believers sold their belongings and gave to the poor, and also gave and shared their belongings with the poor, it actually meant their houses too. Early believers would donate essentially their house to the church. Literally, they would hand their title to their homes over to the church for the church to use their homes as they deem necessary. And so a few of these churches are known as title churches, in which the church owned the title to the home. And in this case, the folks moved out of the house. They no longer lived in it, but rather the home was changed in order for the church to use at its own discretion.
So, Daddy, just to clarify, Dura Europus was the first evidence of a church building per se?
It's the oldest home church that we still have, or that we still had in existence.
That is still in existence?
I don't know. Again, I'm not sure how much of this, I'm not an archaeologist, I'm not sure how much of this is still in existence. Or the building. I do know that the area, again, between the years of 2011, 2014, was under heavy conflict. And so some of the area may have been destroyed in that conflict.
So, Daddy, you said that people move out of they'd move out of their houses and give the title deed to the church, but then where would they live?
With other people. Maybe they could have been rich enough that they could have had multiple homes too. So they
So
could
just
have.
all basically they gave their title deeds to the church and everyone just kind of popped around with each other?
Could have been, yeah.
Back then, you have to think also, they didn't have as much junk. Thank you, Andrew. They didn't have as much materials as we do.
There's no Roman U-Haul.
Exactly. Like, honestly, they, their belongings, literally their clothes.
Yeah.
There was nothing probably not as much as sentimental as, what we have today.
Right.
Their clothes was probably it. Versus
Probably not
us.
as many as what of these. I forgot what they're called.
Poops.
Poops.
Yeah, that's right.
So in the 2nd and 3rd centuries, however, so late 2nd century, early 3rd century, which would be 250 to 300, and 150 to 200, 300, we saw a major shift in Christianity. Okay, what we saw was this influx of pagan mysticism into the church. Okay, in this time, we started seeing these Christian believers having reverence for the dead.
This was around when?
The second to late second to early third centuries. So, and what they ended up doing is because of the persecution happening and people starting to die for their faith, the early believers wanted to honor the martyrs. They started actually praying for the martyrs. As in, after they died, they started praying for the martyrs. And then, lo and behold, it eventually turned into they were praying to the martyrs.
Mm-hmm.
And it got so weird, at least in my opinion, that the Christians started having meals in honor of the martyrs, and that included, in their own minds, their own ideas, they were having meals with the martyrs. The way they would do that is that they would go to the local seminary. Cemetery, sorry, not seminary. Cemetery. They would go to the local cemetery, and they literally at the graveside of the martyrs would have meals, would fellowship. That's where they would have their church service. Another interesting fact, this gave birth to the Christian funeral service that we celebrate today. Our Christian funeral service actually is rooted in this pagan practice.
So should we not have funerals?
I'll let you decide that.
What'd you say?
Should we not have funerals?
Oh.
Should we just let 6 feet under and say, hey, peace, bye?
Well, didn't they
So-
Let the
they
dead
would,
bury their own
didn't
dead.
they used to mourn when people were born, and then
They
they
did.
would rejoice
That's
when
what I was
they
getting
died?
to. The first and second century believers actually mourned on birthdays, and they celebrated days of death because they knew they were going to
Heaven.
heaven and being resurrected and spending time with Christ. They didn't go as far as celebrating the martyrs. They celebrated on the person's death. It wasn't until the second and third century where they started coming back and celebrating with the martyrs on the grave sites of the martyrs.
Okay.
So in third century, Christians started worshiping in two predominant places. Can you name them?
The cemetery.
Cemeteries.
And the seminaries.
Cemetery. And what else? We already mentioned it earlier.
The homes.
The home,
The
yeah.
title home.
Yep, home. So the cemetery and the home.
I feel like more the cemetery is more like the whole where you get the witches and like the Halloween stuff, you know?
So is this
Mhm.
where they did their study, or what did they do here? Just
Well, so a couple of things. In the cemetery, they generally had meals with the dead. Now they wouldn't, and I'm not saying that seances and that kind of stuff. I'm just saying they had meals in the presence of the martyrs because they felt that sacramentally the martyrs, even though they were spending time with Jesus, that they were actually there in their presence.
Wait, Daddy. So how is the You said that when they were starting to do this stuff in the cemetery, they were copying a pagan practice. So, had
The pagans did this. The pagans worshipped their dead.
okay, and then so they were copying the pagans, or they just started doing it and it was the same thing as the pagans.
They started doing it. And there was some influx coming in. There's a word, we talked about it before, called syncretism. It's where we take external beliefs and we try to wrap them in to our Christian beliefs. This, we started seeing that John wrote his letter, his first epistle, because syncretism started invading the church. And by second and third century, there was a ton of religious shifting inside the church. That there was a lot of practices, a lot of pagan practices that were being co-observed by believers. This is one of them. Christians believed that the cemetery is where the martyrs were just simply sleeping. We got
But where would have been their foundation for that truth for them?
other beliefs.
Yeah.
They adopted other. There's no scriptural. Of course, they didn't have the Bible, but there's no biblical belief.
They're just pulling it from other.
They're pulling it from others. And we'll see in a minute that they did have some help. There was some urging from outside
What is that
influences.
word?
Chemiteria. It
Okay.
simply means sleeping or sleeping places.
Which I can see that back then, because like even among my friends, just if they're not in the Word, they'll believe all kinds of garbage. Even if they're Christians, so I can see definitely back then, if you don't have the actual Word, that you can be influenced by a good friend that believes this and that, and
Which, honestly, y'all, this is one reason why I know we're not opening up the Bible today, and we probably won't do so next week either. But it's because I want you to understand where a lot of this stuff is coming from, because I don't want you to be influenced outside. I want you to know the Scripture and what we believe and why we believe it. So that's why I'm spending time on this. So looking at chemiteria, anybody want to guess what English word we get?
Cemetery.
Cemetery. Very good. How'd you know?
Daddy, I have a question.
The other reason, so they worshipped in the home and cemetery. So we talked about the spiritual implications of why they worshipped in the cemetery. The other implication was simply a practical one. As I said earlier, persecution was increasing. So there was laws that were being created inside cities and towns that were preventing Christians from worshiping. So they went outside. Usually the cemeteries were on the outside of the walls. So they would go on the outside of the walls to the cemeteries and worship without being hindered, without being persecuted. They essentially did it to stay off the radar. Now we do have some historical evidence where laws were created that actually prevented them from worshiping or continuing to worship in the cemetery, but they moved out there to, again, stay off the radar. So since the cemetery started becoming these holy places where the martyrs were buried, Christians started building shrines above their graves. Okay,
or their markers.
there were markers, but they started building shrines, obelisks, and other nice ornaments around
like
their grave.
an upgrade or
An upgrade, yep.
Yeah.
And they did this because they wanted to show reverence to the martyr, but they also believed that this was a really holy place. And so they wanted to accentuate its holiness by making it something great, by bringing a lot of attraction to it. And it, in essence, it could be considered what they would consider then an upgrade to their worship service. Okay? Small monuments were built, especially of the graves of the saints, and a shrine over a burial spot was again another pagan practice. The pagans did this. Christians borrowed it. Now what I'm doing here, by the way, is I am getting to a point of where did we come up with all the stuff that we're doing today in a church, okay? I'm trying to give you guys some context to answer kind of, like I said, the question that I asked earlier, how did we get to where we're at today? So that's what I'm trying to fill in the gaps here, is giving you some context, showing you that the time was ripe for the church and these buildings that were about to be erected and why they were erected. Also in Rome, Christians began decorating catacombs. Okay? They took this so far that instead of staying above ground, they even went into subterranean graves and started marking catacombs with Christian symbols, worshiping in the presence, again, of the dead. Now, despite what Hollywood would teach you or would show you, and despite what maybe the History Channel would show you, we have no evidence whatsoever that Christians ever went to the catacombs to hide from persecution. Hollywood would tell you that, History Channel would tell you that, but we have no evidence to support that theory. They went to the catacombs to worship with the dead. And then, 2nd century, they then started venerating or holding worthy or thinking something other than the bones of the saints. This was the first demonstration of Christian relics or religious relics, collecting relics of the dead.
What are relics now? Modern relics. Christian
Like a
relics.
statue of Mary? Or
The Statue of Mary, the Shroud of Turin. I'm sure there's. I'm not
Yeah. I didn't mean to-
educated in all that, but
Yeah.
they still do exist. Taking pilgrimages, those kinds of things.
So Daddy, what were you saying about their bones and how that relates to the...
Well, they started collecting bones and other artifacts of the dead, believing that they had some kind of holy significance to them. Again, this whole, I hate to use the term sliding scale, but what we see here is that the Christians in the late 2nd, early 3rd centuries were growing increasingly pagan in their practices. There was also a shift in how they celebrated communion. We're not going to go there this week, but I'll just throw that out there. Okay?
There's a what? I'm sorry.
There's a shift in how they celebrated communion. Okay? We'll get into that more when we look at what we do in a worship service. But right now, we're just talking about the building of the church. So to sum all this up, by the 3rd century, Christians had established sacred places, i.e., the graves of the martyrs, and they established sacred objects.
Wait, you said... You gave me the 2 points, but then what was the thing you said that the 2 points mean? Or like...
Sacred objects and sacred places.
Yes, but what was the tie of...
By the 3rd century, Christians had both of these.
Okay.
And as we'll look at in a couple of weeks, having either one of these was a direct affront against the Scripture. Jesus actually taught otherwise, and we'll get into that by looking at Scripture.
Sacred... What was it? Sorry, what was 2 points? Sacred places and...
Sacred objects. The bone collecting, the relic collecting, all of that. So what we started seeing in the 3rd century was the Christians started adopting this magical, mystical mindset of pagan religions. It started coming in to their patterns and practices. Now, one more name I'll throw out there to you. Emperor Valerian. He conducted a lot of persecution against the believers during this time. Okay, but then his son, Gallienus. None of y'all actually have to pronounce this. His son Gallienus came in and actually stopped the persecution, or at least decreased it to a lesser degree. And in this, Valerian actually took away all of the homes that were given to the church, all the property that were given to the church. Gallienus restored all that. Okay, so all these homes, these title homes that we talked about, that the church owned the titles to, Valerian took away all of that, forcing believers to leave their homes and go to the cemetery. Gallienus restored the church's property.
He was a successor.
He was the son of Valerian.
Okay.
So the Valerian, he took away them, and then Gallienus, he like restored them to the people, basically.
Yep. And so in this period, we started seeing this small acceptance being restored of believers. Not significant, but a small acceptance. Okay? So in this short period, once Christians had favor, once they had the property back, what we saw was, instead of Dura Europos, where we had that single house, in this period, Christians would buy additional property, and they would build what they called prayer halls, or they would tear down their original homes and build prayer homes. So this was the predecessor to what we would consider a church building, okay, during this period. They simply called them prayer halls, but essentially it was a place where large numbers of believers could come and pray together and worship.
What part of the Bible do you think this is? Like, is this part of like First Timothy, First John?
This
or-
was
after-
after, way after.
all way.
Because Revelation was what, 90 AD?
Yeah,
Okay, 98.
Yeah.
Okay, just
the
making sure.
95, yeah.
Okay, perfect.
But it hasn't happened before Revelation 1 yet.
Thank you.
Or 21, 22,
21.
I guess.
Uh-huh.
That could be coming next week. We never know.
Yeah, you never know.
I'm ready, I'm down.
When they started building these buildings, guess where else they built them?
Near cemeteries.
On top of the graves of martyrs. Okay, they started building these small homes or small buildings. These buildings were actually what Rome eventually absorbed into some of their small parishes that you still see or that you've heard about. It wasn't their cathedrals, but Roman parishes are still some of these homes that were built during this period.
Makes a concrete slab problematic.
It does. And so last thing, because of these buildings popping up, this actually caught the attention of Diocletian. And if you know church history, Diocletian, between the years 303 and 311, okay, is when, for record, we have the greatest persecution of Christianity.
So what did Diocletian have to do with all this?
Because Gallienus gave Christians kind of their rights back, or at least their property, they started building all these large homes. So for the first couple centuries, they, like I said earlier, they tried to stay under the radar. Okay, now they felt a little bit more secure to come out from the radar, and because they were getting attention from Rome and from the Greeks, Diocletian didn't like that. Okay, so then he started persecuting believers, Christians. So I want you to think back to all that we just talked about for a second. Okay, it wasn't when you read again the letters of 1 John, and he wrote them to the church of Ephesus. Ephesus didn't have a building. There was no First Baptist of Ephesus or First Presbyterian of Ephesus. Okay, there was no big building. So what I did in all of this was I wanted to show you the progression and what Christianity was going through, almost the history of the early church and what they faced. Some of their beliefs and how they eroded, some of their syncretism and how they adopted other beliefs. But all of this created a perfect dynamic for Constantine.
Yeah.
between years 285 and 337.
That's life or that's reign?
That was his life, yep. He was the emperor of Rome in 324. Okay?
He's before Diocletian?
After. So everything that Diocletian did brought on persecution. Constantine came back and said, all right, we're going to make Christianity an official religion of the state.
He was the successor, direct.
Well, I don't know the relationship. I have to look that up. But he was emperor. He eventually grew to be emperor of Rome. He didn't start out as emperor.
What does 324 mean?
That's the year he was
came.
the emperor of Rome. He became emperor of Rome in 324.
So what do you? Okay, so you said that Diocletian, he was persecuting all the Christians, and then you said that Constantine was like making Christianity an official religion.
Correct, yes. It was believed that Constantine had a conversion to Christianity. However, history and what I'll share a little bit with you would challenge that idea. Okay? That his conversion wasn't full and authentic. So, when Constantine became emperor, he essentially created a building program. He started building these huge cathedrals in Rome. Guess where he built them?
Cemetery.
On top of graves. Yeah,
Do any remain?
they do.
Why did he build them over there?
Because, interesting,
Crowd wasn't gonna complain.
well, the interesting thought here was this. He believed, read between the lines here, he believed that having a building legitimatized the Christian's faith. Okay, so side note here.
Because that's what everybody else had.
That's what everyone else had. The Jews had their synagogues, the Greeks and Romans had their temples. Well, Christians need to have their own buildings. That way it made them at least equal to the Jews and the pagans. Okay? Again, reading between the lines, side note, when Janine and I started this fellowship, we had quite a handful of people tell us, you can't be a church. You don't have a building. This whole concept of a building legitimatizing a church was born out of Constantine.
Mom, is that what it means when we sing the timeline for CC? Constantine legalizes Christianity.
Mm-hmm.
And all of this idea of what Constantine brought to the Christian church, even though he legalized it, his version of Christianity was heavily rooted in superstition. So part of the superstition that Constantine, what?
No, Ian,
Oh, that Constantine introduced into the church was that he never really abandoned sun worship. Okay, he worshipped Sol Invictus. Another name would be Mithras. Some people combine the two names. There is a Persian version of Mithra, but essentially the same thing, the sun god. For Rome, this was the unconquered sun.
So wait, Constantine worshipped?
Yes,
before he became a Christian?
while he was a Christian, after his apparent conversion.
Okay, so
He
both.
never gave this up. This is part of the problem. This is part of what we see in the church today, which we'll get to.
No, I'm not trying to muddy the waters. To me, it reminds me of Solomon kind of with his wives.
Oh, it reminds me of a whole bunch of New Old Testament kings. First Kings, Second Kings, First Chronicles, Second Chronicles. Constantine kept the sun on his coins. He also created a statue of the sun god that bore his own image.
This is like Tammuz and all that.
And then he also constructed a statue of Cybele, who is the mother goddess, also the Greek name for is Rhea, but she was thought to be the mother of Zeus. Now, he constructed a statue of her, but at least he constructed a statue of her in the praying position.
No, that legitimizes.
That makes it so much better.
Yeah,
What was her name?
Cybele.
Someone's galloping.
Looks like Sybil, but
Oh,
it's
that's how you
Cybele.
spell it. I was thinking.
Yeah.
But if they could have seen the sun the way we see it today, as far as, you know, it really is incredible. But we give glory to the one who made the sun, you know. But I mean, it's astounding. The sun is astounding.
So regarding the idea of the Sabbath, okay? Jews practice Shabbat as the last or the seventh day of the week in remembrance of God resting on the seventh day of creation. Okay, their Shabbat started at around 6 p.m. The Christians, and they called it their rest day. Okay, that was formerly they called it their rest day, Shabbat. Okay, the Christians they moved it to the first day and called it the Lord's Day out of remembrance of the day of Christ's crucifixion. Okay, and where Jews started at 6 p.m. Greeks and Gentiles, or not Greeks, Gentiles would wake up around 6 a.m. before the sun rose on Sunday and would worship. That's when their Sabbath officially began, or their Lord's Day began. Okay, so Christians called it the Lord's Day out of recognition for Christ's crucifixion, and they moved it to the first day of the week. Jews considered it the seventh day of the week, and they simply called it the rest day out of remembrance of God resting from creation.
Could you write that on the board? Because I'm trying to write it down, but I'm getting lost with the chief and the call off.
Christians, Lord's Day.
So seventh day meaning Saturday. So Sunday's the first day of the week.
In whose term?
I
Whose
don't know.
idea?
Whoever's coming.
For Jews, Sunday was the last day of the week. For Christians, it was the first day of the week.
Okay, so it's still the same day.
Yes.
Okay.
You know how our calendar shows like Sunday on the first day of the week? Yeah. And so, and then like Jews' calendars, you'll see Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday. But in our American calendars, it says Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. Like that.
Does that make sense?
So, yeah.
Picking up what I'm putting down?
Don't
Mhm.
erase yet.
Yeah, don't erase it.
All right, I'll keep going.
Okay.
So what do you think Constantine named that day?
Sunday.
Sunday.
Dun, dun, dun.
Gosh, Andrew.
Waiting for like 20
No one
minutes.
would have known you got a 70 in history. Your dad's gonna have a lot to edit out. Sorry, Joshua.
Say what?
I said you're gonna have a lot to edit out. I'm sorry.
That's okay. I'm not editing anything. I'm not having to telling kids to be quiet or anything today. And obviously he did it out of remembrance. I'm not going to put remembrance of, but Mithras, or the unconquered sun. The other thing here is that Constantine made Sunday a national holiday of rest every week. That's why Sunday became the rest day, and it became officially everyone rested. Whereas Paul said, some celebrate the Sabbath on one day, some celebrate the Sabbath on a different day. Doesn't matter when you celebrate it as long as you rest. Jesus told his disciples that man was not made for the Sabbath. The Sabbath was made for the man. Because God knew we needed a day of rest. Constantine created a national holiday out of it and literally forced people to rest.
Versus now in America, there's no rest day.
Daddy, the Christians, that one started, you said at 6 on the
No,
Sunday?
no, no. Just Gentiles started. Both Jews and Gentiles had the seventh day.
Mhm.
Okay, Christians celebrated it as the first day.
She's
Yeah,
saying
but-
6 a.m.
Yes.
I- at 6
They
a.m.
celebrated at different times.
She's asking what time.
Yeah, just whenever they got together. Now, we call it Sunday. Technically speaking, Constantine called it the Day of the Sun. To be more formal. Now, this whole idea, I've erased it, but this idea of Mithras or the unconquered sun, keep in mind that Constantine legitimatized or made Christianity legal. Okay? And what he tried to do is he tried to marry the two religions, Mithras, the worship of the sun, and Christianity, which is why when St. Peter's was excavated, there was a mosaic of Christ as the unconquered sun.
Perfect. When you say St. Peter's was
Basilica in Rome.
when it was what now? I'm sorry.
Excavated. When they came and they started pulling things out from underneath it,
Mhm.
they're cleaning it out.
Oh, okay. How about that? Did they have that?
Oh yeah, they archaeologists found it.
How about that? That's crazy.
It gets crazier.
Yeah.
So just wait.
There's more.
There's more. So Constantine retained the title Pontifex Maximus.
Wait, that was his title?
That was one of his titles. It means the chief of pagan priests.
Mhm.
And ironically, it's the same honorific title given to the Pope today.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Dun,
Current
dun, dun.
Pope.
Wait, how do you spell that name?
Pontifex Maximus.
Possibly Maximus.
Yeah, it's clearer now when you were talking about you weren't sure if there was a true conversion. Gee whiz.
But wait,
There's more.
Daddy,
enough.
I didn't get a chance to write down what you had on the board before, but so was Mithras the sun god?
Yes.
yes,
That's who you worship.
Or, okay, so Constantine worshipped Mithras, who was the sun god.
yes.
But then why would he even bother bringing Christ in the mix?
Yeah.
Just wait.
There's more.
Well, maybe it's a political reason of keeping the peace of the people. Like, okay, they're going to worship Jesus. Okay, they're going to do this. So let's just kind of.
Well, it could be
No,
kind of
no,
like
no. It goes back to what I was just sharing a moment ago. He recognized that there was power in Christianity. And so by elevating Christianity, what we're about to talk about is him, especially his mother Helena. She was a huge collector of Christian artifacts, Christian relics.
His mom.
His mom.
Was she Helena of Troy?
I don't know, but Helena. So they believed in the magical and mystical powers of the Christian relics. So he elevated that to give him power.
And that's the.
As a matter of fact, when he constituted Constantinople, he actually prayed and recited magic spells over Constantinople to make sure that it would prosper.
Sweet.
Yeah, again, kind of makes you wonder, was this conversion real?
Daddy, so when you're talking about the title that they give to the Pope, do they give the Pope the title Pontifex Maximus, or that's the name? What's the title?
It's a title that the Pope acquired in the 15th century.
What's the title? Like,
Pontifex Maximus.
okay, but isn't it? So that's the
It's
guy's
an honorary
name.
title. It's not his name, it's an honorary title. Like
It's a
doctor or pastor or
Okay.
it's a
Bishop,
title. Bishop,
cardinal.
yeah.
So then, who initially had that title?
Constantine.
Okay.
So he was in charge of both at one point.
In charge of both what?
Well, Catholicism is just now starting
Yeah, that's
out.
what I'm saying.
It wasn't really a thing yet. He was talking about Christianity and Catholicism. Catholicism is just now starting out.
Because then there was a whole church split with the Greek.
Into Roman Catholic.
Yep.
It's a song I'm singing. I don't know
It's from
this.
CC.
All right. So in Rome, there's a Church of the Apostles. Do I need to write that on the board?
Sure.
No.
Church of the Apostles. In this church, he built 12 different statues, one for each of the apostles. Okay? They're all facing in, they're all in a circle, and then he built a grave right in the middle. Guess whose grave that belonged to?
His.
His. Because he was so egotistical, he elevated himself essentially to the 13th apostle. And he believed that he was the greatest of
Wow.
all the apostles, and so they were all facing in, giving him that honor.
Where did he locate the grave? Where was that? Where did he build it? Like the one with the disciples?
Is it in the,
The Church of the Apostles.
Which is where?
Probably the Vatican.
It's
Yeah.
probably somewhere. It's in Rome. I'm not sure exactly where it's at.
when did the whatchamacallit come to be
Vatican?
the Vatican? Thank you.
I don't know.
Okay,
Not there. I'm not sure.
that's fine.
We're still way beyond that.
Okay.
Way before that. So, and here's why he did this, because one, he was, like I said, he was an egomaniac. Obviously, he thought really high on himself, but he also, again, what I shared with you earlier about the pagan beliefs, in that they were honoring the dead. Guess what? He not only wanted to be honored while he was alive, but he also wanted to be honored while he was dead.
Great.
Was he
Generally,
married?
you don't say.
Did he have any children? So how many wives did he have?
Okay, so last thing we'll cover today is I talked to you about earlier in the 3rd century, Christians had their sacred objects in sacred places. Okay, and Constantine, again, perfect landscape. Constantine took that and built upon it. Okay, it basically laid the groundwork for him to do his thing in 300 BC or 300 AD. Sorry. Because of his influence, relic collecting essentially blew up. Okay, again, people were trying to collect the bones. They were trying to collect relics and artifacts of the early martyrs. As a matter of fact, Helena, his mother, was obsessed with relics. She made a pilgrimage to Palestine. She also claimed that she found the nails in the cross that Jesus was crucified on.
Conveniently.
Conveniently. And both Helena and Constantine believed that just splinters from the wood of the cross had magical powers. Finally, he built church buildings as shrines over the graves of dead saints. Named them after the saints. Again, they were considered holy spaces. So not only did they collect relics, but they essentially built shrines or built relics over the graves of these saints. And many of the largest buildings were built over the tombs of martyrs, based on the idea that martyrs had the same power as the gods of paganism. Some of these churches are St. Peter's on Vatican Hill, St. Paul's outside the walls, Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, and Church of the Nativity in Bethlehem. What we're starting to see is the church building take place. The series that we're looking at, that we're going through these next 3 weeks, is the edifice of the church, looking at the building and why the building was constructed the way it is. We're going to stop there today because we're now getting to a point of, all right, now he's building the buildings. Next week, we're going to look at, well, how did he build the buildings? What was his thought process in the way the buildings were constructed? And if you thought today was eye-opening, wait till next week. and it will shock you. And then again, 2 weeks. We got some back there. 2 weeks from now, we'll talk about the scriptural implications of all of this. Okay, and obviously that's the most important. This is just history filling in the gaps, but I want you to understand again a lot of the stuff and what we do today. Let me just throw this out here as a final warning. I don't want you going home and be like, man, church sucks. This is horrible, and it's all built on pagan practices, and forget the church. That's not the intent here. The intent is to educate you so that you, as an educated believer, can weigh what's good and what's bad, and say, all right, I accept that practice, artifact, whatever, in the church worship, in the church building, and how we do things. I accept that for sake of peace among the believers. I'm not here to throw a monkey wrench and cause turmoil or strife within the church. But it is my responsibility to teach y'all, to make sure you understand what's being done, why it's being done, some of the intent and purposes behind it. And then, again, arm you with Scripture so that you can guard your hearts and minds and worship freely the Lord. But don't go out and, let me just charge you with, don't go out today and go banging on churches and be like, hey, you're doing it all wrong. That's not the goal here. You would be in the wrong at that point.
Man.